It was early in the morning of the 10th of June in the year 2236. The sun rose in unrivaled splendor over the immense city of London, the superb capital, not only of England, but of the world, the solar system, and the stars. That's right, it's one of those books. The Struggle for Empire, a story of the year 2236, is an early science fiction novella that imagines a British Empire expanding its colonial aspirations to outer space. The text was written by little-known photographer and author Robert William Cole in 1900. That was the same year as the first Zeppelin flight, and 3 years before the Wright brothers launched their plane at Kill Devil Hills. 1900 also marks the midpoint of new imperialism, an era of renewed European colonization, primarily in the interest of resource extraction and the cultural assimilation of indigenous peoples. 1900 was furthermore a year where, in South Africa, the British were sending recalcitrant Boers to concentration camps to cement control over Transvaal and its gold mines, while on the other side of the world, the predominantly European eight-nation alliance was calling the Boxer Rebellion and keeping China open for Western markets and influence. Needless to say, this book was born out of an era of both technological advancement and extreme national chauvinism. I first heard about this novella through Sven Lindqvist's book, A History of Bombing. Remember those choose-your-own-adventure Goosebumps books, where they say, if you do this, go to page 105, if you do that, go to page 89? This book was similar, except the story is all linear, and the sections are just organized chronologically, so you're jumping through time as you explore the histories of flight, bombs, rockets, etc. Lindqvist was educated in literature, so he's all too familiar with how fiction reflects the ambitions and biases of the author and their milieu. So to support a lot of his claims about cultural attitudes towards the implications of planes, bombs, and military technology, he's been making occasional references to rather obscure and interesting texts. The Struggle for Empire is one of them. I first read this book a few years back, but it was juicy enough for a second read and a full analysis, so let's get into it. Plot. We start with some lore building. There was a great European war in the early 20th century between countries like Britain, Germany, Italy, the United States, numerous minor countries. Where have I heard of this before? But in this timeline, it's the English, Germans, and Americans against everyone else. They're all Germanic countries. I'm sure that's just a coincidence. In the end, the Anglo-Saxon team wins, and England annexes all of Turkey and a bunch of Russia's Asian holdings, while Germany grabs parts of France, Italy, and Russia. Subsequently, the United States and England unite, and join a federal union with the rest of the Teutonic states of Europe. Because why not? Then the entire French race f***ing dies off for no reason. Seriously, that's actually what happens. The Italians, Spaniards, and Turks croak too. Soon, in Cole's words, finally, the Anglo-Saxon race was dominant over all the globe. Next, the world enters a stupendous scientific revolution. Why? It's because people stopped studying useless things like ancient and modern languages, literature, theology, history, and philosophy. To quote Cole, the vast amount of intellect that had been hitherto wasted on these branches of learning was then wholly concentrated on the study of physics, chemistry, biology, mathematics, and engineering, as being the only subjects that gave an adequate return for the labor spent upon them. One fantastic discovery researchers make is that the attraction of gravitation could be prevented from acting on a body by surrounding it with wires, through which peculiarly constituted currents of electricity were flowing. I'm not really sure how that works, but apparently that's how we invent flying machines. Scientists also uncovered what Cole ambiguously terms three new and extremely powerful forces: dynogen, pralien, and ednogen. They're inexhaustible and can be found all around. When put together, they expel an amount of energy equivalent to thousands of horsepower. Okay, horsepower is not a measure of energy, it's a measure of, power, but whatever you say, Cole. When you combine these three forces with anti-gravitational technology, you get interstellar travel. So explorers started colonizing the planets of the solar system. Mars, Mercury, and Venus are uninhabited. The outer planets are inhabited, but the natives are described as harmless, so they're just glossed over. All the planets have trees, animals, fruits, and mineral wealth, just like Earth. The Anglo-Saxons come into contact with another race, the Syrians, who rule from the planet Kyrat. They're the Anglo-Saxons' equals in technological and military prowess, but the two powers envy and distrust each other, sparking an arms race. At this point, we've caught up to the 10th of June, 2236. We meet Flora, the only daughter of renowned scientist Dr. Houghton. She's dating 25-year-old Lieutenant Alec Brandon, who visits her to share a dinner of space fish and attend the theater. On the way, they encounter the eccentric Dr. James Tarrant, who's on the verge of making his greatest scientific discovery. What it is, we don't yet know. Other than that, it would make the Anglo-Saxon Armada obsolete. A few weeks later, breaking news. The Anglo-Saxons and Syrians are quarreling over a remote planet called Iosia. The Syrians attack, but the conflict reaches a stalemate. The Syrians demand one half of the planet, even though the Anglo-Saxons got there first. When England refuses, Carrot formally issues a declaration of war, proclaiming that military operations will begin in 3 months. Well, that's nice of them to give the Anglo-Saxons a heads up. The Anglo-Saxons summoned their fleet to London and strategize, since no one thought to test the warships in combat. Several thousand vessels will go on the offensive, while the remaining ones will form 3 lines of defense back in the solar system. Meanwhile, the dockyards go into overdrive, producing more warships. We now return to the main characters. Flora bids Alec a tearful goodbye, and he sets off to war on the starship the Lightning. When he returns, he says he'll be made a captain, and the two will marry. Alec sails into space and watches his fiancée disappear. But the captain reassures him he'll see her again, or heck, maybe even find someone that he loves more after they conquer Kyrat. Alec professes his singular love for Flora, but the captain is still dismissive, though he changes his tune once he realizes how broken up the lieutenant is, and he encourages him to remain faithful. It takes the advancing forces 1 month to reach Neptune. The fleet moves into the great beyond, and Earth doesn't hear a message from them for 18 months. But in the meantime, let's get into the specifics about Alec's voyage on the Lightning through space. It's pretty uneventful, we mainly just learn more about how the ships work. 11 days in, an unfortunate steering malfunction causes 2 battleships to crash into each other, sending body parts and shrapnel everywhere. Apparently, space is really dark, so the ships need to have their headlights on to avoid colliding with each other. They eventually land on Neptune, which has continents, mountains, and oceans. The sailors are allowed to rest 1 day and visit the ballrooms before heading off beyond the solar system. 85 days after leaving Neptune, the Anglo-Saxon fleet encounters the Syrians. The battle begins. For Cole, interstellar combat is a spacecraft launching rays of fire, cannonballs, and torpedoes at each other. And when that doesn't work, they just ram into the enemy. Some of the Syrian ships are attached to Neptune, so part of the Anglo-Saxon fleet pursues them. But no damages seem to be dealt to the enemy, like the vessels are impermeable. But actually it was a trick, it was just an illusion. What the Anglo-Saxons were actually seeing was the reflections of intact ships hundreds of miles ahead. There's not enough ammunition to go the rest of the way to Kyrat, so they return to Neptune to rejoin the rest of the fleet. The main battle goes on for days and days and days. Nearly 1 week, in fact. And it doesn't end well for the Anglo-Saxons. With defeat inevitable, the Admiral-in-Chief orders the remaining functional vessels to charge at the Syrians. A noble last stand, but a doomed one. The Lightning finally sees combat a few days into the fight. The ship becomes littered with corpses and takes a pummeling, but the captain refuses to surrender. Something in the air causes Alec to go unconscious. Alec wakes up in the care of Celia Eastland as they sail through space on her brother's yacht. The siblings are going on a casual cruise through a battlefield like we all do, and they scooped up Brandon from the ship's wreckage. The rest of the crew already perished. You can probably guess what happens next. Alec falls in love with his self-appointed nurse, and a few pages later we already get this. They always talked together and behaved as lovers, and her brother began to look upon them as already engaged. She effected the conquest of his heart more and more every day, as she flitted about before him, a smile on her lips, and her wealth of golden hair falling in silken ripples down her back. He thought he had never seen anyone so pretty or engaging before. It was many months now since he had seen Flora, and it would be many months before he could see her again. For the war was raging all around the planet, and it was unsafe for any boat but an armored battleship to venture into space. Didn't take long to forget Flora, did it? I find it funny that it's too dangerous for them to return to Earth in anything but a battleship, yet the Eastlands are brave enough to retrieve the wounded Alec from a battlefield, and that journey would have been 85 days each way, whereas a trip to Earth from Neptune only takes a month apparently. In the meantime, Alec hangs with his lover on Neptune, which is periodically showered by destroyed starcraft hailing from the skies. Meanwhile, the Syrians break through the first line of defense and advance into the solar system, destroy most of the Anglo-Saxon fleet at Jupiter. Much of the remaining ships gather in between 2 of Jupiter's moons. A wave of energy released from the battle by Neptune drifts into the solar system and somehow pulls the two moons together, smushing the Anglo-Saxon and Syrian fleets in between. By this point, the best Anglo-Saxon generals have been killed, and the remaining ships filling the defense lines closer to London are composed of obsolete vessels and inexperienced soldiers. On the bright side, the Anglo-Saxons are destroying more Syrian vessels than vice versa. Things start to look grim, and it comes down to the last line of defense protecting London, as Earth tries to churn out as many ships as possible. Spacecraft are also stored at underground dockyards to emerge when needed. Soon, the Syrians are close enough to lay waste to the city of London. Before the Syrians can land, they have to get more supplies from their transport ships. So who comes to the rescue? Dr. Terran. Remember him, the guy on the brink of making his greatest discovery? He's invented the electro-ethnogen machine, which is capable of disabling anti-gravitational devices. He's produced 50 of them, and once they manufacture a few more, mount them on ships, and venture into space, they deploy them against the Syrian armada and turn the course of the war. The Anglo-Saxons sail across the galaxy and enter the Syrian solar system, encountering little opposition, as in an act of hubris, the Syrians sent more of their reserves to join in on the plundering of Earth. The Anglo-Saxons make it to Kairat and the battle ensues. The Anglo-Saxons suffer heavy losses, but in the end, they prevail thanks to the electro-ethnogen machine. At last, the Syrians surrender and relinquish claim of Iota. Additionally, they hand over another planet to the Anglo-Saxons, agree to pay a war indemnity, and set some limit on the size of their fleet. After raging for 6 years, the war concludes. With the intergalactic conflict over, Alec can finally return to Earth in order to break off the engagement with Flora. Actually, what it seems like he does is break up with her through letter. Then they meet in person and talk, and then they part, forever. She's very stoic about the breakup until Alec leaves the room. But she's not sad for long, I guess. In honor of his service, James Tarrant is made Prince of Kairat, Duke of England, etc., etc., and apparently he always loved Flora, so the two marry, and that makes her the Princess of Kairat. Then the book just ends. That's it. Analysis. Racism. Yeah, based on what you've already heard, I bet that was a huge surprise. If you're curious why I never said human or humanity in my summary, it's because Cole virtually never uses those words. He's very clear that it's not humanity conquering the galaxy, it's the Anglo-Saxons. One wonders if Cole even thought that non-Anglo-Saxons were capable of space colonization in the first place. At the very least, it seems that Cole could more readily imagine the other races dying out than a collective humanity launching vessels into the sky. I mean, the Anglo-Saxon race dominates the globe before space colonization even begins in his text. I like to call this style of book racist Victorian-era sci-fi. No one quite does racism like the Victorians. The racism of Cole and his contemporaries is very forward-looking. It's optimistic. It's intrinsically tied with techno-progressivism. They take it for granted that one day the Anglo-Saxon race will rule over the Earth, aided by their sci-fi toys. That's probably why he doesn't linger much on the loss of other ethnicities. And where he does talk about their destruction, it's framed in terms of absorption. The late 19th century wasn't just the era of imperialism, it was the era of social Darwinism. The United States is following its manifest destiny, its obvious fate, cleansing Native Americans from the land, and trying their darndest to turn the survivors white. In New Zealand, the colonists were quote-unquote smoothing the pillow of the dying Maori race, as it seemed just a consequence of biology that indigenous people would eventually give way to European settlers. And for Cole, it's just natural that one day the Anglo-Saxons will inherit the Earth, the solar system, and beyond. And they'll just Borg any resistance into non-existence. One interesting aspect of the book I really noticed through my second read was how little fascination there was around the fact that we meet extraterrestrials. I had honestly forgotten entirely that the gas giants were described as having inhabitants, but for Cole, it's no more special than discovering that some random Pacific islands are inhabited. Watch my video on Hawaii Story by Hawaii's Queen. The only aliens that matter, the only races that matter, are those that might pose a threat to the Anglo-Saxons. And even then, what about the Syrians? We know absolutely nothing about them, other than the name of their metropole and that they're similar in advancement to the Anglo-Saxons. But not equal in advancement, for that would have to mean that the war must end in a stalemate. Cole's not really interested in them, they're just a cheap foil for his chosen race, and we can only presume that if Cole wrote a sequel, they'd go the way of the dodo too. Militarism and imperialism. What is the book's position on militarism? Are we supposed to take the jingoism and warlordism seriously, like Starship Troopers the book, or ironically, like Starship Troopers the movie? Cole does make some occasional jabs at imperialism and militarism, but they're very situational. For instance, many secretly wished that the national ambition had been more restrained, and that they had been contented with their own planet, and not crossed the oceans of space in search of fresh lands and fresh enemies. The critics in Cole's book don't balk at imperialism or militarism, they balk at these forces left unchecked. The Earth is man's domain, or the Anglo-Saxons' domain. There are more than enough nations to exterminate on the planet, so why venture out and risk biting off more than we can chew? But that's not even the position Cole takes, in my opinion, since we have 3 times as many passages that are like this. The Admiral-in-Chief displayed a signal to the whole fleet before it went into action. It was, "England expects that every man will do his duty," a signal which historical records tell us was used by a great commander in the old days of battles on the sea. For Cole, space is just an extension of the ocean. As Britain ruled the seas in his time, she will rule the cosmos in the next. In spite of anti-war gestures here and there, far more characters proclaim death before surrender. As far as Cole is concerned, the Anglo-Saxons will ultimately rally together and fight for more Lebensraum, no matter the cost. I also want to highlight, too, how morbid some of the battle scenes are, and how Cole seems to be completely oblivious as to the full horror of this future mode of combat he has envisioned. The scene between the decks was frightful. The guns were dismounted from their carriages, which were twisted into every conceivable shape. Fragments of human bodies were strewn about everywhere, and the floor ran with blood. Ship's twisted metalwork was covered with blood, human bodies were lying about in the pierced compartments torn almost to ribbons, and arms, legs, and headless trunks were squashed between bent metal plates and rods, or rammed up between the machinery. Imagine you're in a tin can between 15 and 300 feet in length. You're surrounded by the void of space for millions of miles. You're getting blasted by cannonballs, torpedoes, and at any moment, this glossy energen substance can waft through the hull and asphyxiate you. And as the fight drags on, the deck becomes littered with dismembered corpses and flooded with blood. That's an absolutely horrifying sight. Like no one but an absolute psychopath is walking away without extreme PTSD. If Cole was really anti-war, moments like this would be the time to proclaim it, or at least condemn this future mode of combat for the needless viciousness it is. But no, it really is just imagery. Cole doesn't provide any value judgments. Just like with the Anglo-Saxons conquering the world, it's just there. It might be cruel, but that's just how things go. If I recall correctly, I think Lindquist's interpretation was that the book was not anti-war so much as anti-unpreparedness, and that's definitely an interpretation I can endorse. Cole makes reference several times to how the Anglo-Saxon dockyards have failed to produce enough spacecraft, and this negligence proves catastrophic for England. Why had they been so slack in their preparations? Such was the lamentation uttered by hundreds of captains when they began to recognize their own powerlessness to turn away these terrible fleets. Perhaps we can contextualize this fear in light of the arms races going on in Cole's time, like when Britain and Germany were vying to wield the largest navy. The Industrial Revolution allowed humanity to construct implements of both life and death en masse. Whatever your thoughts on war, people like Cole will certainly argue that if your neighbors are preparing for conflict, you better prepare too, regardless of your own intentions. For me, it's pretty cut and dry that this book is pro-imperialism, but even if you want to argue against that, it's extraordinarily difficult to interpret this book as anti-war. World building. The world building in Cole's book is dreadfully lacking. It's a book that's at once imaginative but also highly parochial. His 3 elements, dynogen, pralien, ednogen, are probably the best examples of this. What exactly are they? We don't know. He just kind of throws them in there as god particles that can do anything. For instance, ednogen is capable of disrupting ship's signals. It can melt rocks. It can give people spasms. When combined with the other substances, it's rocket fuel, etc. So on one hand, yeah, Cole's imaginative enough to envision future humans as possessing flying contraptions and extracting hidden forces from our environs, but he's too parochial to actually flesh these concepts out or give them any detail. Cole's vision of scientific advancement comes down to 19th century alchemy. Actually, let's talk a little bit more about Cole's scientific speculations. Some people online have claimed that Cole predicted holography, but not really. When Alec and Flora visit the theater, they hear an orchestra that's not really there, and they see a spectacle of houses, clouds, and thunderstorms that aren't really real. But that's all the detail that Cole gives. He's not providing any hints as to how this is accomplished. For all we know, it could just be mirrors. I mean, that's exactly what the Syrians do later with their deceptively intact fleet. Contrast this with sci-fi holography, which is usually a form of volumetric display where thousands of light points are projected over a three-dimensional space. You would have to do a lot of heavy lifting to say that Cole predicted holography. One of my favorite sci-fi ruminations, though, is what Cole's done with climatology. Apparently the Brits get so sick of their island being grey and miserable all the time, they tilt the Earth so that London is in the tropics. From my limited understanding, that would push the North Pole to somewhere south of the Bering Strait, and push the equator up to Mexico and northern India, probably rendering a lot of populous places uninhabitable. So I love the idea of the British fucking everyone over just to get a reasonable climate. But wait, what am I talking about? All the other nations have already gone extinct. Plot and characters. There's not that much to say about the plot and characters. Like a lot of other sci-fi future war books of the time, it's mainly exposition with a flimsy narrative for a backbone. Alec and Dr. Tarrant are just cheap vehicles for keeping the story going, placed there to keep the novella from turning into a purely speculative essay. The character development is non-existent. Let's be honest, sci-fi books aren't usually known for their nuanced characters. They're usually idea-based, like what would happen if England started colonizing the galaxy, with the characters formulated farther down the line. I don't need to waste any time telling you how one-dimensional the characters are, especially Alec Brandon, who abandons his bride-to-be for the next woman he meets. The dialogue is hot garbage. Here's Flora's opening line and the first dialogue we get. "What a beautiful thing life is," she murmured, with the joyous accents of early maidenhood, as she tripped lightly out into the garden. "Everything around me is so fresh and bright. How happy I feel. Only 3 more hours and I shall see my dear Alec." I too love stating the obvious. In my opinion, Cole should have scrapped having characters at all, or if he was to include any, they should have been people in the British High Command or aristocracy, or people who actually had military influence, so he could have followed the progression of the war from their perspective. Conclusion. Some of you might think I'm being too critical of Cole. After all, he's writing sci-fi in the 19th century. Here's the thing though. This book was published 2 years after H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds, which beats Cole's book on just about every level, most notably in its critique of imperialism and social Darwinism. It also just helps that Wells was actually versed in science, giving the devices of his stories more verisimilitude than the inexhaustible dynagen and anti-gravitational electric wires of Cole. There's a reason why novellas like this are forgotten. They're just not that good. Conceptually intriguing, sure, but the poor execution causes everything to fall apart. The Struggle for Empire is a fascinating book for a multitude of reasons, but in my opinion, it's something that's far more fun to analyze than read. The 2 types of people I'd recommend this book to are early sci-fi nerds and post-colonial studies students. Otherwise, I don't think it should be high on your list. 1.5 out of 5 stars.